Hello everyone, my name is Nina and today I'll be talking about my research project, which is investigating the relationship between personality, self-care and well-being. For today's agenda, I'll be talking about the background literature, hypothesis, methods, results, discussion, and then I'll give you a take-home message. So let me first properly introduce myself. My name is Nina Hyland and I've been studying at Bangor University, finishing my master's degree in counselling. I've been studying psychology for about 5 years and I've actually did my undergrad here in Bangor as well. And for those that know me, they know that I'm always someone with a question. And this time my question was about self-care, because we're always recommended to recommend that to our clients and to do it ourselves. But what does that actually mean? How do people actually engage in it? And since no one was able to give me an answer, I decided to do this study to find out for myself. So the reason that we engage in self-care is to attain well-being. Here we'll define well-being as a state in which an individual can realize their own potential, can cope with life stresses, and are able to work productively and to positively contribute to their community. This is demonstrated in the hierarchy of needs, as you can see here, created by Maslow. And according to his theory, you need to be able to move from down here to up here in order to achieve well-being, which is self-actualization. And in order to do this, you need to progress from one stage to another. But because of stress, sometimes we're kind of prevented from moving on. And that's where self-care comes in, which is defined here as engaging in activities that assist the individual coping and increasing their well-being. So looking at the hierarchy of needs, there are actually 6 domains of self-care that you need to be able to meet in order to achieve well-being, which are physical, professional, relational, emotional, psychological, and spiritual. As I was researching self-care behaviors, I found that actually a lot of people prefer to engage kind of in one self-care activity, kind of their special hobby, and that seems to be enough to increase their well-being without focusing on all the different aspects of self-care. And there was a bit of a limitation with that in the sense that this actually resulted in a lot of clients not understanding what self-care is, thinking it's just about one good hobby, or when you think of self-care, you think of kind of like the soft self-care, for example, taking a bubble bath. But there's also the hard self-care, which requires you to look after yourself in a sense that you need to cook for yourself, make sure you drink enough water, exercise, that sort of thing. But many people struggle with it since they're not aware of it. There's actually been a new movement in prescribing self-care, which is social prescription. It is defined as a way to address non-medical needs that can affect well-being. So for example, if there's like an activity in the community, like playing tennis, instead of prescribing antidepressants, physicians might ask the patient to try that first to see if it increases their well-being. And there has been mixed reviews on that. Some say that it really helps them, and with others, they say they actually end up feeling more isolated. So what is the difference? Why does it work with one type of individual and not with the other? So symbolic interaction theory states that people react differently due to different will perceptions, which might explain why some people found social prescription so helpful and others didn't. So this kind of sounds really similar to personality, introversion and extroversion. So here we'll define extroversion as gaining energy from an external source and experience the world externally, whilst introverts, they gain energy from internal sources and experience the world internally. When I started talking about introversion and extroversion, many of you already probably have certain stereotypes associated with it. So, for example, there is a stereotype that introverts only prefer to stay at home, not interact with anyone, whereas extroverts constantly seek that social attention. And as we discussed previously, introversion and extroversion has got more to do with how you respond to the world rather than how you interact. But these stereotypes are here in society and it can make it difficult for people to access help or interact because people already have certain assumptions about them. There's also an assumption that introverts engage in more self-care, so you'd think that their well-being would be higher. But that's not the case. It shows that introverts actually report higher level of anxiety and depression. So people theorize that, well, if extroverts have higher well-being, it only makes sense that introverts should copy what they do for their self-care in order to increase well-being. But there's not much support in terms of scientific literature for that claim. So this study will kind of look at the different self-care behaviors each personality type has and how it interacts with well-being. And this leads to our hypothesis. So hypothesis 1, extroversion will be positively correlated with a group activity preference and introversion will be positively correlated with individual activity preference. Hypothesis 2, there will be a significant positive correlation between extroversion and well-being, and there will be a negative correlation between introversion and well-being. And the last hypothesis, there will be a significant negative correlation between introversion and engagement in self-care. And now I'll explain the methods of the study. So we recruited our participants via Sona and social media, mainly Facebook. And Sona is a university online platform where students post and complete each other's studies. We recruited most of our participants from social media, which means our target demographic was anyone over the age of 18. In total, we had 157 participants who completed the study, and only 50 of them were from Sona. Yet we only had 146 databases or data sets to analyze because some of them were missing data, so we had to exclude them from the study. Now I'll talk you through the design and measures. So we used a questionnaire which was created using Site Toolkit, and this is a free online platform where people can create their research projects for any social science. Participants were invited to complete an online questionnaire and they were presented a brief information sheet followed by a consent form. Whereas for demographics, which is age, sex, gender, then the questionnaire began after they confirmed that they're above 18 and the questions were presented in the following order. We measured their well-being using the Wellbeing scale, which is a 14-item questionnaire with a 5-point Likert scale. And you're presented with phrases where you're supposed to say with how much you agree with it, ranging from not at all to very much agree. Next, we measured preference for engagement, which was a 12-item questionnaire with a 5-point Likert scale. And I'll show it to you in a second. That's the one that we created for the study. And then we used the exact same 12 items in order to measure their preference for social interaction, but instead of the 5-point scale, you had 3 answers, which is, would you prefer to engage in this activity individually, in a group, or if you had no preference? Then we asked the participant to give an estimate of their self-care engagement per week in hours. And lastly, we asked participants to complete some of the parts of the Big 5 inventory, but we only used items 1, 6R, 11, 16, well, you can see on the screen, because they address specifically introversion and extroversion. And then after participants were shown a debrief page after their completion containing a thank you note, and contact for details of all the researchers and supervisors if they have any concerns, and then we used SPSS to analyze the data. So here is the scale that we created, and as you notice, there are 12 items on it. So there are 2 self-care activities per the 6 self-care domains that we have discussed previously. Moving on to ethics, all participant data was anonymized, so we can tell who completed what. Participants were briefed about the aims of the study beforehand, along with the data confidentiality, so they were given all the information they needed to give their informed consent. Participants were invited to give their emails to get a brief summary of the results of the study, and all of them were blind copied into it, so no one would be able to tell who took part of the study. All data was stored in the secure university password-protected storage system, OneDrive, and it was only available to the researchers and the associated examiners. And here are our results. We found that actually there was no correlation between personality and preference, and although insignificant, we found that most people engage or prefer to engage in self-care alone. There was a significant correlation between personality and well-being, more specifically extroversion. So extroverted reported way higher well-being than introverts. There was an insignificant correlation between personality and engagement in self-care. And other significant correlations we found was well-being and engagement, and well-being and hours of engagement in self-care. Here I'm just going to show you the significant correlations, and as you see here, this is the main one for well-being and personality, and extroversion here was the one that was actually significant and not introversion. And as you see here, that's where most of our extroverts were, and as you see, the well-being is way higher than the introverts down here. And here are the other significant correlations you could see below. And now I'll explain what these findings actually mean. So here's just a brief overview because there's a lot to cover. We found that personality does not indicate how individuals prefer to engage in self-care. I found that most individuals do prefer to engage in self-care alone, and I'll explain why that may be. Personality is correlated with well-being, but it's not impacted by self-care practices. So why do extroverts have higher well-being than introverts? Both personalities engage in a variety of self-care activities, yet this seems only beneficial for extroverts, and I'll explain why that may be as well. And it seems that taking time to engage in self-care is indeed linked with higher well-being, so it's important to support clients to do so. So if people engage in self-care alone, regardless of their personality types, that shows that some of our assumptions could actually be harming the relationship. Since, especially in therapy, we kind of assume what an individual might prefer to do based on their personality types, we could end up harming them. So, for example, an extrovert who's struggling, we might assume that engaging in self-care activities that involve other people could be helpful for them. But since that's not their preference, we could actually end up doing more harm than good. And this kind of shows some evidence that social prescription may not be as effective as previously thought. So now let's have a look as to why people might engage in self-care alone. And after doing some research, I suggest that this might be actually an adaptive preference, because our current modern environment is very overwhelming to our senses. We're always seeing, so many ads every single day, flashing lights everywhere. We're constantly on our phone. There's just a lot of social input. And it's truly difficult to find time to be just completely alone without any of that input. And being alone has been found to create feelings of freedom, creativity, and intimacy. And since it's so rare, it only makes sense that we seek time alone to recover. So maybe that's why, regardless of personality type, we may prefer to engage in self-care alone. So this kind of suggests that as therapists, it would be beneficial for us to look into what this individual self-care might look like and to support clients to do that. So now let's look at personality and well-being. And we have found that extroversion was correlated with well-being, but we originally thought that that was due to the preference of how to engage in self-care, that since they might prefer to engage in self-care with lots of people, that's kind of like a protective factor. But that's not the case. So why do extroverts report higher well-being? Here are some of my theories. It could be that extroverts kind of recover from social interactions quicker than introverts. What I mean by that is when you walk past someone on the street and you talk to them, an extrovert might just be able to talk to them and not think about the interaction afterwards, whereas an introvert might dwell in it. It's not always negative, but I'll get back to that, but it still just kind of spins around in the head. It could be that introverts experience highly daily stresses because of the societal expectation to interact a lot more than we have in the past, and just not being able to manage that expectation. So as we discussed in the beginning, extroverts gain their energy from external sources, so from talking to people, but for introverts, they might find talking to people draining and are not able to recover their social battery as quickly as they may need to in order to beat those societal expectations. Also, the maintenance of social support can have something to do with it. So although extroverts may prefer to engage in self-care alone, just knowing that there are people out there for you is a big help for your well-being. But introverts might struggle to maintain that kind of social network. And the results to that, they might actually struggle to seek out help since they don't have the necessary energy available to reach out to a brand new person, whereas an extrovert might be able to reach out to a friend, and that's a lot easier to do. As we discussed previously, personalities will interpret the environments differently, and one of the studies found that extroverts are actually less likely to attribute any problems to themselves. So an introvert is most likely to blame themselves for everything, and not being able to see the problem as nothing to do with them personally, but rather with the external environment. And blaming oneself for most issues is actually a maladaptive behavior, showing that introverts might actually need more support in that area. So all this kind of shows that simply copying what extroverts do will not be helpful at all, since they already seem to be engaging in similar behaviors, i.e. engaging in self-care privately. Rather, learning about the social environment of both personalities and learning to adjust the self-help practices to cope with the modern environment will be effective. So now let's look at personality and self-care engagement. So we found there was an insignificant correlation between personality and self-care engagement. So this means that people prefer to engage in a wide variety of self-care activities rather than just having that one specific hobby, regardless of their personality type, which contradicts one of our hypotheses as well, because we thought that only introverts will have that one special interest rather than extroverts who'd like everything. And studies do show that having a wider range of self-care activities protects against stress better, and it targets the different areas of self-care that we have discussed previously. Yet it shows that only extroverts, for some reason, were benefiting from this and not introverts. So why is that? So after some further research, I found that the main benefit of engaging in a wide variety of self-care activities are actually feelings of belonging and self-esteem. And I found that introverts actually struggle in those areas. So they reported having lower self-esteem and they kind of struggle to find belonging in their real life. So to cope with that, they kind of develop online parasocial relationships, which can become a maladaptive coping method if you're not careful. So for example, it encourages negative self-comparison to other people and encourages interpersonal distrust, which makes reaching out for help a lot harder, since if you don't trust the people around you, how are you supposed to find help? So practitioners should be aware that recommending more self-care activities may not be effective, since both personality types seem to be engaging in it, but introverts are not exactly getting the benefits. Rather, a focus on encouraging feelings of belonging and self-esteem may help increase well-being in various facets. So now let's look at well-being and time. It is shown that both of them are correlated, which shows that taking more time to engage in self-care will increase your well-being. This could be because of the strengthening the brain connections, and with more repetition, your brain becomes more used to it. So you could almost train yourself to relax on command. So when you engage in self-care, you increase your well-being. But studies show that when people are under stress, they tend to avoid self-care. And as we discussed previously, it shows that introverts might actually be more stressed than extroverts, so they may be more at risk. However, it is important to be mindful of the stereotypes and support all stressed people with their self-care engagement. So there were some limitations to the study. For example, there was a noticeable imbalance of extroverts and introverts, so we had a lot more extroverts. That might have skewed the results. We also didn't analyze a specific preference in regards to if people would prefer to engage in a wide variety of self-care activities or not. So with a 5-point Likert scale, the results might have been skewed by extreme answers, like 1 and 5, so we don't have like an accurate understanding if people actually prefer to have a wide variety of self-care activities or not. And we also had some students that we analyzed, although it was only like 50 of them that took part of the study. They could have lower well-being scores due to the stress of the course that might not be representative of how they usually feel. As for future research, it might be beneficial to investigate why individuals prefer to engage in self-care activities more specifically, and further investigation of the effectiveness of social prescription. It would be good to investigate why introverts have lower well-being, along with the effects of modern environment, and looking into how to support introverts in developing adaptive self-care behaviors. And it would be important to investigate what correlated extroversion and well-being, along with how better to support them if anything goes wrong. And now we've finally come to the take-home message. So personality stereotypes can be inaccurate, meaning that acting on them could be negatively affecting the clients. Simply copying self-care behaviors of an extrovert is not effective in increasing well-being in introverts. And it's important to actually have a look at the environment people live in, and learning to cope with societal expectations of socialization might be more effective in increasing well-being. Thank you so much for listening to this. It really means a lot to me, and I hope you were able to learn something from this. Thank you again. And here are some references in case you want to have a further look at them. And if you have any questions, please comment down below and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you again for listening. Here they are.